You can go on the Soil Health Institute's training site, and we put together some evaluation cards. This time of year, you're out harvesting, you're trying to think about soil health, what you might start on your field. Is there a way to evaluate that? And we've come up with just a few indicators that you can do just with stuff that you have around the farm. We call it Walk the Field, and you can download these. And I'm just going to run through each one of these individually real quick. When I meet with producers, I like to start just looking at the surface. You know, you look at the soil surface. One key indicator, if you want to know if your soils are going to be healthy or not, or function, if they're going to function like they're supposed to, do you have any residue on the surface? If you don't have any residue, then there's no way you can be feeding that soil biology. You can't be protecting that soil from raindrop, impact of raindrops and erosion. You can't be protecting that soil from drying out. So if you have no residue, you need to really start thinking about what you can do to get some residue on there. Other things you ought to be able to pick up, the surface ought to be, if you pick up a clod or a small aggregate, it ought to crumble. You shouldn't have to hit it with a 3-pound mallet to get it to bust up. It ought to crumble very nicely. And this may sound a little silly, but a lot of folks there, you walk across the field, it's got good soil health, it's got a little spring to it, it's got a little bounce to it. That's because you got aggregation, you got residue there, and it's got something, you know, one of the functions of soil is to support agricultural activities, hold up a piece of equipment or something. You can do that with a soil health if you're implementing a soil health management system. The second thing you look at is look at that residue. Brush it aside. Are you got residue from 3 or 4 years ago? If you do, that means your soil is not very biologically active. It's not being broken down. Residue is meant to be broken down by the biology, and by that I mean the earthworms, the pill bugs, the bacteria, the fungi that thrive and are sustain soil health. You know, if you're breaking your residue down by running over it with a piece of equipment, your soils are not very functioning. You know, you ought to see 60, 70, 80% residue cover. You know, and that residue isn't meant to stick around. Good healthy soil field's got good soil health. You may end up with residue 6, 8 inches in the spring. By the fall, it may be broken down where you're barely covering the middles. That's a normal process because your soil is biologically active. You ought to be able to see some darkening. You'll see some fungi and those types of things, and it ought to be shredded, and you ought to start to see some surface aggregation. Those are things you can all do pretty easy. This is one that's real simple to do. You can do this sitting in your pickup truck. Next time you get a big rainfall event, you know, 2-3 inch rain, go out and drive the neighborhood. You see where the water is going. If all the water is ponding and if it's been there for more than a day or so, that means you have very poor infiltration, and it's not going to, and it's going to run off. It's not going to soak in the ground. A good healthy soil can absorb 2, 3, 4 inches of rainfall in an hour pretty easy. And why is that? Because you have a diversity of pore spaces. You got big pores, small pores, it allows that water to move down through there. Water should not sit in your field if it's good, healthy soil is functioning properly. The fifth thing you can do, is this is one that takes a little bit of prep work. You can grab a clod out of the field and let it dry out on your dashboard or something like that for a day, and then take it back to the barn, farmstead there, and drop it in a clod of water or a glass of water. It should hold together. And good healthy soil's got biologically active. They got the biology in the soil's got glues in it. It'll hold that aggregate together. You'll have root mass in there. So a soil aggregate is made up of sand, silt, and clay, but it also is made up of organic matter. It's made up of the glues of the biology in there. And water, as it rushes in and fills up those pore spaces, isn't strong enough to cause that clod to dissolve. An unhealthy soil doesn't have that. You drop that in there, and it'll basically dissolve. Much like a fizzy or something like that you would drop. I probably just dated myself there using that word fizzy, didn't I? Anyway, it'll dissolve and break apart, and it won't hold together. That means it has poor aggregate stability. That means the soil can't support any kind of equipment. You'll rut up your fields and those types of things. Very, very easy to do. The only thing here is you got to let that dry out a little bit. The sixth thing to do, these aren't any particular order. When you're looking at that residue, you brush it back, you ought to see some kind of life. You ought to see evidence of biology, like earthworms. It's not unusual to dig up a spadeful of healthy soil and see 2, 3, or 4 earthworms. If you don't see the earthworms, you'll probably see their cast, which is earthworm dropping, so to speak. That's a good indicator. You ought to see holes. You ought to be able to see pill bugs, ants, spiders. There's a lot of life down in there because your soil is healthy, you're providing a food source, and that biology is really important about breaking that residue down and incorporating into the soil surface. Here's an easy one you can do. Take your soil's temperature. Why is that important? Well, especially in the beginning of the growing season, if your soil temperatures get up above 100 degrees, which is not hard to do in a normal springtime when the ambient air temperature may be 85 or 90, that direct sunlight hitting that soil surface, if it's not protected by residue, can get up 100, 110 degrees. Why that's critical? Because that turns the biology, it damages the biology, it creates an unfavorable condition for those microbes that are favorable for food and fiber production to thrive. So take your soil's temperature, you know, try and keep it down at that 90 or 85 degree or less. How do you do that? You keep a residue cover just like a mulch blanket you would in your garden, and they do that by growing a cover crop. The next thing you can do is take a look at your roots. Pull the roots out of the ground, pluck up a plant. You can do that now. I'm standing in this cotton field, pull 1 or 2 plants out and take a look at the roots. Roots ought to grow straight. Normally they'll grow straight until they hit a restrictive layer, such as a compaction that's caused by tillage implement or a natural like a fragipan or something like that. But if your roots are all jagged and they look like the crooked man who walked the crooked mile type of thing, that means that they're being impeded. They're not being able to grow good. And so roots will tell you a lot about soil, tell you where compaction is. The other thing you need to do, you can take a look at organic matter. And basically, you ought to start to see in that top ½ inch, 3/4 inch, you start to see an accumulation of organic matter as that residue breaks down. It moves down through the soil profile and helps to, it gets incorporated. What happens when you do tillage, you mix that all up, you help to accelerate the oxidation of that organic matter, and it's released the CO2 into the atmosphere. So again, it's normal to see a stratification of a dark surface. That's a good thing. That means you're doing something right. And then the last thing you can do is smell your soil. Soil ought to have a rich, earthy smell to it. If it doesn't have a smell, and it's going to happen again, you know, this is something you'd be more likely to do in the spring than the fall, because the soil is a little more biologically active, but that's a good thing. That means you got good aeration. That means your soils are not waterlogged, they're not saturated, you're getting a good gas exchange. And now all the crops that we use for food and fiber production require aerobic plants. They don't grow, they need oxygen to survive, so they need to have that balance. So again, if your soil has a good earthy smell, that's a good indicator that you're probably doing something right.